Miss Marple and the Cursed Knitting Needle. Welcome to Cafe Tales. I'm Ali, your host, and I'm so glad to have you with us again. Tonight, I'd love to ask you something. What is it that makes you enjoy these cozy mysteries? Share your reason in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for new stories every day. Now, let's begin tonight's mystery. Chapter 1. Night and Accursed. Needle. The January evening had settled over St. Mary Mead with that particular quality of cold that seems to seep through even the stoutest walls. Miss Jane Marple, wrapped in her good gray coat and carrying her knitting bag, made her way along the high street toward Hart's haberdashery with the careful steps of one who has learned to respect icy pavements. The shop windows glowed with a cheerful yellow light, and through the glass Miss Marple could see that quite a gathering had already assembled for the Women's Institute Knit for Winter evening. It was, she reflected, a very sensible sort of event. The war might be over these 10 years and more, but there were still those who could benefit from warm woolens, and the WI was nothing if not practical. A bell tinkled as she pushed open the door, and she was greeted by a wave of warmth and the pleasant smell of wool and lavender sachets that characterized Ellen Hart's establishment. Mrs. Hart herself was a capable woman of perhaps 45, with steady hands and a businesslike manner that concealed, Miss Marple had always thought, a kind heart. She was directing the arrangement of chairs in the back room with quiet efficiency. "Miss Marple, how lovely. Do go through. Mavis has brought something rather special to show everyone." Miss Marple found her old friend Lady Bantry already settled in one of the better chairs, her own knitting proceeding at a leisurely pace. Dolly Bantry had never been what one might call an accomplished needlewoman, but she enjoyed the social aspect of these gatherings immensely. "Jane, there you are. You must see what Mavis Cotter has brought. Quite Gothic." Mrs. Mavis Cotter, the WI convener, was a woman who thrived on drama of the respectable sort. She stood near the work table in the back room, a small silver case held reverently in her hands, surrounded by several interested ladies. "It belonged to my great-aunt Hester," Mrs. Cotter was saying, her voice dropping to a thrilling whisper. "She had it from a lady in Bath who died very suddenly the day after she acquired it. They say it's cursed." She opened the little case with a flourish, revealing a single Victorian steel knitting needle of unusual length. Its surface was dull with age, but still perfectly straight. "Nonsense, Mavis," said a brisk voice from the doorway. "Needles don't carry curses, they carry stitches." The speaker was a woman of perhaps 50, smartly dressed in a navy suit, with an air of unshakable certainty about her. This, Miss Marple understood, must be Mrs. Rowena Drake from Reading, the pattern judge who had been invited to assess the entries for the WI competition. Mrs. Drake advanced into the room with the manner of one accustomed to being listened to. "I've seen 100 such needles. Steel, probably 1880s, nothing remarkable except that someone has attached a silly story to it. Now, shall we proceed? I have a train to catch at 9:30. There was a slight stiffening among the gathered ladies. Miss Marple observed it with interest. Mrs. Drake was clearly one of those unfortunate people who confused efficiency with rudeness. "Of course," said Mrs. Hart smoothly. "Ladies, if you'll take your seats, we can begin the judging. Mrs. Drake has kindly agreed to assess our entries for the baby layette section." As the women settled themselves, Miss Marple accepted the silver case when it was passed to her. The needle was indeed unremarkable, though well made, but as she went to lay it back in its case, she noticed something curious. The needle seemed to snap toward the silver quite sharply, with more force than one would expect from mere gravity. "Magnetized," she thought. "How interesting." She said nothing, merely passed it along to Dolly, who examined it with the air of one inspecting a museum piece. The judging proceeded. Mrs. Drake moved from entry to entry, her comments crisp and frequently critical. This decreasing is uneven. The buttonholes are poorly finished. Charming color, but the tension is quite erratic. Miss Marple, watching the faces of the knitters, saw lips tighten and eyes grow cool. Mrs. Drake might be correct in her assessments, but she had entirely failed to grasp that these were labors of love, not commercial products. A younger woman, whom Miss Marple recognized as Sylvia Brent, a designer of some local reputation, stood near the back. Her own entry, a delicate matinee jacket worked in an intricate cable pattern, lay on the table. When Mrs. Drake picked it up, Miss Marple saw Sylvia's hands clench slightly. "Competent," Mrs. Drake said, examining it through her spectacles. "Though I fancy I've seen something very like this pattern before." "Still competent?" The faintest flush touched Sylvia's cheeks. "It's my own design," she said quietly. "Indeed," said Mrs. Drake in a tone that managed to convey polite disbelief. She set the jacket aside and turned to Mrs. Hart. "I should like to see your new equipment, Mrs. Hart. Someone mentioned you'd acquired one of the modern umbrella swifts. I'm always interested in seeing how provincial shops are keeping up with the times." There was a barely perceptible pause. Then Mrs. Hart, with admirable composure, smiled. "Certainly. It's in the workroom. I'll show you now if you like," along with a new ball winder that Mr. Priest was kind enough to provide. At the mention of Mr. Priest, there was a stir. A rather oily-looking man who'd been hovering near the wool displays moved forward with an ingratiating smile. "Lionel Priest, madam, of Northern Counties Wool Suppliers. Always happy to help valued customers demonstrate modern equipment. Though I say, Mrs. Hart, you really should consider our new synthetic blends. Every bit as warm as Shetland and half the price." "Thank you, Mr. Priest," said Mrs. Hart with less warmth than before. "Mrs. Drake, this way." The two women moved toward the workroom at the back of the shop. Miss Marple glanced at the little clock on the mantelpiece. It showed 20 minutes past 7. The remaining ladies resumed their conversation in lower tones. Miss Marple picked up her own knitting, a simple stocking in gray wool, and began to work. Her needles moved steadily, but her eyes were alert. 15 minutes passed. Mrs. Cotter poured tea. Sylvia Brent had moved to a corner and was demonstrating a cable technique to two interested members, her fingers working with practiced ease. Mr. Priest had stepped outside for a cigarette, visible through the front window. The little shop was warm and peaceful. Then, at precisely 7:40 by the mantelpiece clock, there came from the workroom a sound. Click, whir, thud. Miss Marple's needles stopped moving. Several of the ladies looked up, mildly curious. Mrs. Hart appeared in the workroom doorway, her face suddenly pale. "Mrs. Cotter, Miss Marple, would you come here, please?" "Quickly." Her voice was quite steady, but Miss Marple, rising at once, recognized shock when she heard it. They found Mrs. Rowena Drake lying on the floor beside the work table, very still indeed. Chapter 2. A Judge in the Workroom. Dr. Haydock arrived within 7 minutes, which was remarkable considering that he had been at home with his feet up and a glass of whiskey at his elbow when Mrs. Hart's breathless telephone call reached him. He was a stout, sensible man who had seen a great deal in his 40 years of practice, and very little surprised him anymore. Mrs. Rowena Drake, however, presented a sight that was at least unusual. She lay on her right side near the work table, one arm flung out, her spectacles askew on her nose. The umbrella swift, that pleasant device for holding skeins of wool while they are wound into balls, stood on the table with its wooden arms at an odd angle, no longer perfectly aligned, as such things ought to be. Beside it, the ball winder's crank arm bore a dull smear that made Miss Marple look away briefly. "Now then," said Dr. Haydock, kneeling with some effort. "Everyone out, please. Mrs. Hart, you may stay. Miss Marple, you too, if you ever mind to. The rest of you, give us room." Inspector Slack arrived as Dr. Haydock was completing his examination. Slack was a man perpetually convinced that he was about to solve a case through sheer determination, and perpetually irritated when Miss Marple happened to notice things he had not. Well, doctor. Dead, of course. Within the last half hour, I should say. Single blow to the left temple, delivered with considerable force. See here the depressed fracture? Something flat and heavy swung with speed. Robbery? Slack glanced about the room, but nothing appeared disturbed. Her handbag is there on the chair, untouched, Mrs. Hart said quietly, and the till in front contains the day's takings. An accident, then. Slack examined the Swift with satisfaction. These clamps can work loose. She reached up, knocked it. The arm swung and caught her. The window is latched from inside, Miss Marple observed gently. And Mrs. Hart says the door was standing open, yet no one saw anyone enter or leave. Exactly, said Slack, as though she had supported his theory. She was alone. Must have been reaching for something. Miss Marple said nothing further, but her eyes traveled slowly over the scene. The room was not large, perhaps 12 feet square, with a single window overlooking the back garden. The work table stood against one wall, sturdy and well used. Upon it sat the Swift and the ball winder, and beside them, laid out on the green baize cloth, was the Victorian steel knitting needle from Mrs. Cotter's silver case. She moved closer, not touching anything. The needle bore a curious mark near its midpoint, a bright band where the dull surface had been rubbed or burnished to a shine. It was not at the tip, where wool might wear against metal, but halfway down the shaft. On the table's edge, just beyond the needle, sat a small round object. Miss Marple recognized it as one of those retractable measuring tapes that dressmakers use, housed in a tin case no larger than a pocket watch. She reached out, then paused. "May I touch this, Inspector?" Slack waved a hand impatiently. "It's only a tape measure, not likely to tell us anything." Miss Marple picked it up carefully. The metal case was faintly warm to the touch, which was odd in the cool of the room. When she pressed the button, the cloth tape shot back inside with a sharp, decisive snap. There was a smell of oil and old cotton. "Mrs. Hart," she said, "is this yours?" "Yes, I use it for measuring sleeves and such." "It was in the drawer, I believe. And this Swift. Is it your usual one?" Mrs. Hart moved forward, frowning slightly. "No, that's the new one Mr. Priest brought last week. My old Swift is in the cupboard. He was most insistent I try the modern design." The Swift in question was indeed of recent manufacture, its wood still pale and unscratched, the metal clamp bright. The clamp had been fixed to the table edge, and Miss Marple noted the fresh indentations where it gripped the wood. They were perhaps an inch farther in from the table's edge than seemed quite natural for such a device. "Mrs. Hart, where would you normally place a Swift?" "Farther in, so the arms have room to turn without risk of catching. But I didn't set this up. Sylvia did earlier today." Inspector Slack had been examining the Swift's arm with grim attention. "There's a scuff mark here, about the height of the deceased's head. Could have swung round and struck her just so." "The window was latched," Miss Marple repeated softly, "and the door open. Yes, we've established that. Clearly an accident. Woman reached for something. Perhaps that needle there, knocked the Swift and it swung round. Tragic, but these things happen." Dr. Haydock stood, brushing off his knees. "It's consistent with being struck by a weighted arm traveling at speed. Whether by accident or design, I cannot say." "That's your department, Slack." Lady Bantry appeared in the doorway, her face troubled. "Jane, is it very dreadful?" "Poor woman, though she was rather sharp, wasn't she?" "Death is always dreadful," Miss Marple said quietly. "And yes, Mrs. Drake was not a woman who inspired affection, but that is hardly relevant now." Slack was making notes. "Right, I'll need statements from everyone present. Mrs. Hart, can you provide a list of who was here this evening?" "Certainly. The regular WI members, Miss Marple and Lady Bantry, Sylvia Brent, Mavis Cotter, Nora Pike, and several others. And Mr. Priest was here demonstrating his wools. This Mr. Priest? What sort of man is he? A wool representative, Mrs. Hart said with slight distaste, rather pressing in his sales methods. He's been urging me to stock synthetic yarns, which I'm not inclined to do. Miss Marple had moved to examine the clamp more closely, though she touched nothing. Inspector, do you see this mark on the table edge? A faint line, as though something had been drawn along it. Slack peered at it. Could be anything. Table's old. Bound to have marks. This one is quite fresh, I think. The wood shows a lighter color where something has rubbed. She straightened, her gaze traveling to the ball winder. Its handle turned a shaft that wound the wool, guided by a small arm with a thumbscrew. On the guide arm's knob, nearly invisible against the dark wood, was what appeared to be a tiny fiber of bright red. How curious, she murmured. What's that? Slack demanded. Nothing certain, Inspector. But I wonder if you might ask whether anyone present this evening was wearing red. Slack looked as though he might argue, then shrugged. If you like, though I don't see what possible relevance. Probably none at all, Miss Marple agreed. One does notice these small details, however. Mrs. Hart had been standing very still, her hands clasped. She was a woman of courage, Miss Marple thought, but this had shaken her badly. I keep thinking of that silly needle and its curse. Mavis shouldn't have brought it. It's upset everyone. The needle didn't kill her, Slack said flatly. A swinging arm did. Though I grant you, having a so-called cursed object about doesn't help matters. Makes people nervous, and nervous people have accidents. Miss Marple picked up the silver case that had held the needle. Its lip showed a tiny mark, as though something had tugged or caught there with force. Mrs. Cotter will want this returned to her, she said, though I fancy she may not wish to keep it after tonight. Curse or no curse, Dr. Haydock said. Mrs. Drake died of a blow to the head, and that's a medical fact. Everything else is supposition. But Miss Marple, looking at the warm tape measure in her hand, the burnished needle on the baize, and the faint straight rub on the table's edge, thought that perhaps supposition was not quite the correct word. Detection, she had always found, began with noticing what did not quite belong. Chapter 3. Miss Marple notices a burnish. The next morning brought one of those pale winter days when the sun seems to hang low in the sky without providing any appreciable warmth. Miss Marple, who had slept rather less well than usual, was in her garden cutting the dead heads from her roses when Dr. Haydock stopped by. "Thought I'd find you here," he said, opening the garden gate. "You're looking thoughtful, Jane." "I am always thoughtful when something troubles me," she replied, snipping another brown bloom. "And last night troubles me considerably. Slack's calling it an accident. Says the swift was poorly secured, and the woman knocked it somehow." Miss Marple laid down her secateurs. "Did he examine the needle, the cursed one?" "What about it?" "The wear pattern is wrong, you see. When one knits, the wool travels over the tips of the needles. After years of use, the points become slightly worn, sometimes even rounded, but the shaft remains untouched, protected by one's hands and the work itself." Haydock waited. Knowing from long experience that Miss Marple's observations, however domestic they might sound, often led somewhere significant. "That needle," she continued, "shows a band of bright polish halfway down its length, as though it had been used for some other purpose entirely, as though it had served as a peg. Perhaps subjected to friction and pressure. A peg for what? That is what I have been considering. The silver case, too, shows a mark, just at the lip, where the needle fits snugly. Something pulled or tugged there with force, leaving a small bruise in the soft metal. She began walking toward her cottage, and Haydock followed. "There's something else that strikes me as peculiar," she said. setting the secateurs on her potting table. That measuring tape. When I touched it yesterday evening, the tin case was distinctly warm. Not hot, you understand, but noticeably warmer than the surrounding objects. Could have been sitting in a pocket, Haydock suggested. Mrs. Hart said it had been in the drawer, and the room itself was cool. No, I think the warmth came from the mechanism inside. A spring that had been extended and held under tension becomes warm when it's released. The friction, you see. Haydock frowned. You're suggesting the tape was stretched out and then snapped back. I am suggesting that possibility. The ribbon shot back into its case with considerable force when I pressed the button. There was also a smell of oil and old cotton. But what is this to do with Mrs. Drake's death? Miss Marple poured them both tea from the pot she had ready in her sitting room. I am not entirely certain yet. But consider the arrangement in that workroom. The Swift's clamp was positioned farther toward the table's edge than Mrs. Hart's usual habit. There are fresh bite marks in the wood, deeper than necessary, and along the table's edge runs a faint line, a straight rub, or something taut pressed against the wood. She handed Haydock his cup. If one were to draw out that measuring tape to its full extension and fix it somehow under tension, it would create just such a mark. And if one then released it suddenly, the spring would snap it back with tremendous force. You're speaking of a mechanism, Haydock said slowly. Some kind of trap. I am speaking of common household items used in an uncommon way. Every sewing basket contains springs, tension, potential energy waiting to be released. One need not be an engineer to understand them. Haydock drank his tea in silence for a moment. Slack won't like this, he said finally. He's already written his report. Inspector Slack frequently forms his conclusions before examining all the evidence, Miss Marple said, with a gentle firmness of one stating an observable fact. But I believe he is a good man at heart, and he will listen to reason if it is presented clearly. And can you present it clearly? This is all rather theoretical. Not entirely. There is the matter of the red fiber. She produced a handkerchief in which she had carefully wrapped a tiny thread of bright scarlet. It was no thicker than a hair, but its color was unmistakable. I removed this from the ballwinder's guide knob last evening. No one noticed, as everyone was rather occupied with the dreadful discovery. Mrs. Drake was wearing navy blue. Mrs. Hart had on a brown cardigan, but someone present was wearing red. Who? That remains to be established. But I noticed that the hook on the end of the measuring tape was slightly twisted, as though it had caught on something and been pulled askew. If that hook had been used to anchor the tape, perhaps around the winder's guide arm, it might have snagged a loose fiber from whatever fabric brushed against it. Haydock set down his cup with a decisive clink. Jane, you're describing murder. I am describing a sequence of events that may constitute murder, she corrected, though I should very much like to examine that workroom again in daylight, if Inspector Slack would permit it. As it happened, Slack was not pleased by the suggestion, but Dr. Haydock's insistence that certain medical questions remained unanswered eventually won him over. By 11 o'clock, the three of them stood once more in Mrs. Hart's back room. The shop was closed, of course, and the morning light coming through the window revealed details that had been obscured by lamplight. Miss Marple moved slowly about the space, her eyes taking in each surface. The Swift's arm, she said, pointing. Do you see that scuff mark, Inspector? It's precisely at the height of Mrs. Drake's temple, according to where she fell. Slack grunted. Already noted that. Consistent with the arm swinging round. Yes, but look at the arc it would have traveled. The arm is hinged here at the center. If it swung naturally, knocked by someone reaching past, it would have described a different path. This mark suggests the arm came from a cocked position, released suddenly like a spring trap. She moved to the ballwinder, examining the guide arm with its small thumbscrew. This screw has a fresh score on it, as though something metal slipped against it under pressure. And the guide arm itself, you see how it's positioned? It points directly toward where the Swift stands. If a line ran from here to there, taut and under tension, and then was suddenly released, the window would jerk, Haydock finished, acting as a fulcrum. Miss Marple nodded. The click, whir, thud that several people heard. First the catch releasing, then the tape snapping back, then the blow itself. Slack was examining the table edge with new attention. This mark here, it is straight and lighter than the surrounding wood, as though made recently. The clamp, too, is positioned oddly, Miss Marple continued. Mrs. Hart is an experienced needlewoman. She would not secure a Swift so close to the edge. But if someone wished to create a specific arrangement, a particular geometry of tension and release. She paused, touching the green baize where the needle had lain. The needle served as the trigger, I believe. Its length and strength made it ideal for holding something in place. The burnish on its shaft shows where it bore weight or friction, and when Mrs. Drake touched it, drew it from whatever position held it fast, the mechanism released. Slack's expression had changed. From skepticism to grim concentration. You're saying someone built a trap here in this workroom using wool equipment and a measuring tape. I am saying it is possible, Miss Marple replied, and that the evidence suggests it may be probable, though proof, of course, requires more than marks on wood and a warm tin case. It requires motive, Haydock said quietly. An opportunity, Miss Marple folded her hands. Yes, she agreed. It requires both of those things, and I believe we shall find them if we look carefully enough at who was here yesterday evening, and why. Chapter 4. The Tape That Snapped Back. Mrs. Ellen Hart sat in her small office behind the shop counter, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had long since gone cold. Miss Marple had asked if she might call, and Mrs. Hart, though clearly exhausted by the events of the previous evening, had agreed at once. I cannot stop thinking about it, she said. That poor woman lying there, and in my shop of all places. Inspector Slack keeps saying it was an accident, but you don't believe that, do you, Miss Marple? I think, Miss Marple said carefully, that accidents sometimes bear closer examination. Tell me, when did Mrs. Drake go into the workroom? It must have been about 7. She'd finished judging the entries and made some rather pointed remarks about modern standards. Then she asked to see the new Swift. I thought it an odd request, but she said she was always interested in equipment. And you went with her to the door? Yes. I showed her where the light switch was. Then came back to help Mavis with the tea things. The room is quite small, you see. There was no need for both of us to crowd in there. Miss Marple nodded. The measuring tape that was on the table. You mentioned yesterday that it had sprung out earlier. Can you recall when that occurred? Mrs. Hart frowned, concentrating. It was before the judging began, I think. Mrs. Drake had asked to measure a sleeve on one of the entries. She pulled the tape out rather sharply, and it made that snapping sound when she released it. I remember thinking the spring was still quite strong for such an old tape. And where was the tape after that? I put it back on the table in the workroom. I'd been using it earlier in the day for measuring some fabric. Who else went into the workroom yesterday? Mrs. Hart considered. Sylvia Brent was there in the afternoon, helping me set up the new Swift. Mr. Priest had brought it the day before, quite insistent that I display it prominently. Sylvia has nimble fingers and understands these things better than I do. Was anyone else present during the setup? No, it was early afternoon. Just Sylvia and myself, though she stayed after I returned to the front. Said she wanted to wind some wool for her demonstration later. Miss Marple's eyes were thoughtful. And the needle, Mrs. Cotter's heirloom. When did she bring it? Oh, she arrived with it just before 6. Made quite a production of unwrapping it, telling everyone about the curse. You know how Mavis loves a dramatic story. Indeed. And the needle was passed around. Yes, most of the ladies examined it. Mavis even suggested we lay it out for luck, though I thought that rather morbid, given its reputation. Still, she insisted, and I didn't want to seem superstitious myself. Miss Marple rose and moved to the door of the workroom. May I? Of course. The room looked entirely ordinary in the afternoon light. The Swift and Winder had been left as they were, at Inspector Slack's instruction. Miss Marple studied the arrangement with the attention she might give to a complicated knitting pattern. Mrs. Hart, you said the tape sprang out earlier. Did Mrs. Drake seem startled or annoyed? Neither, really. She merely made a comment about checking the tension on such things. Then she handed it back to me. How interesting. So she understood about spring tension in mechanical devices. Mrs. Hart looked puzzled. I suppose so, why? But Miss Marple had moved to examine the Swift more closely. She did not touch it, but her gaze traveled over the clamp, the arms, the central spindle. When Sylvia Brent helped you set this up, did you discuss where to position the clamp? I suggested farther back from the edge, as I usually place such things. But Sylvia said this design worked better with the clamp forward. Something about the counterweight of the arms. She seemed quite knowledgeable, so I deferred to her judgment. Miss Marple turned. And later, when the other ladies arrived, did anyone else go into this room? Not that I noticed, though I was occupied with customers until just before the judging. Someone might have stepped in briefly. There was a sound from the shop front, and Dolly Bantry's voice called out, Jane, are you here? I've just had the most extraordinary conversation with Mavis Cotter. Lady Bantry appeared in the doorway, slightly breathless. Mavis is in quite a state. She's convinced the curse is real now, and she wants to bury that wretched needle in her garden. But here's the interesting bit. She swears she never said the needle killed anyone. She only mentioned that 2 previous owners had misfortunes. One was that bus accident you mentioned, Mrs. Hart, and the other was a broken ankle from a fall. Hardly supernatural when you think about it. Yet someone, Miss Marple said quietly, seems to have encouraged the idea of the curse. The question is why? Dolly settled herself in the spare chair. Mavis says the village story has grown over the years. You know how these things do. Someone drops dead the day after acquiring an object, and suddenly the object is cursed. Never mind that the poor woman was hit by a bus through no fault of the needle. A convenient story nonetheless, Miss Marple observed, if one wished to create an atmosphere of supernatural dread. A cursed object would serve admirably. Mrs. Hart was looking increasingly distressed. But who would do such a thing, and why? Those are the essential questions, Miss Marple agreed. Though I suspect the answer lies not in curses, but in something far more mundane. Tell me, Mrs. Hart, how long has Sylvia Brent been designing patterns? 3 or 4 years, I believe. She's quite talented, though there has been some talk. Talk? Mrs. Hart hesitated. Nothing definite. But there was an incident last year where another designer claimed Sylvia had copied a stitch pattern. It was never proven, and Sylvia said the similarity was coincidental. These things happen in knitting, after all. There are only so many ways to cross a cable. And Mrs. Drake, she judged patterns professionally. Yes, for several magazines and WI competitions. She had a reputation for being exacting, sharp eyes, sharp tongue, and a very good memory for patterns she'd seen before. Miss Marple returned to her chair, her expression serene but her mind clearly working. I wonder what Mrs. Drake saw when she examined Sylvia's entry yesterday evening. She called it competent, but said she'd seen something like it before. Do you remember her exact words, Mrs. Hart? She said the pattern seemed familiar, and when Sylvia claimed it was her own design, Mrs. Drake said indeed, in a way that suggested disbelief. A dangerous thing, Miss Marple murmured, to accuse a designer of theft in front of her peers, particularly if one's livelihood depends upon originality. Dolly looked between them. You think Sylvia had reason to harm Mrs. Drake? I think, Miss Marple said, that we must consider who had both opportunity and motive, and who understood the mechanical principles required to create such an elaborate arrangement. She rose, preparing to leave. Thank you, Mrs. Hart. You've been most helpful. One more question, if I may. The typed note Mavis mentioned, the one about the needle bringing harm. Do you still have it? Mrs. Hart went to her desk and produced a slip of paper. The typing was uneven, with one letter noticeably higher than the others. Your shop typewriter, Miss Marple observed. The letter E strikes high, a distinctive characteristic. Yes, it's been like that for years. I keep meaning to have it repaired. Miss Marple examined the note carefully. And Mavis insists she did not type this. She can barely type at all. She's quite firm that she never wrote any such warning. Then someone else did, Miss Marple said softly. Someone who wished to ensure that Mrs. Drake would be drawn to that needle. Someone who understood that human nature cannot resist touching something that's been declared dangerous. She folded the note and handed it back. Thank you, Mrs. Hart. I believe I understand now how the trap was set. The question that remains is who set it. Chapter 5, 2 Swifts, 1 Clamp. Inspector Slack was not a man who enjoyed being told he had overlooked something, particularly by elderly ladies who knitted. Nevertheless, when Miss Marple telephoned him that afternoon and requested he meet her at Hart's haberdashery with Dr. Haydock present, he came. This had better be important, he said, removing his hat as he entered the shop. I've got 3 other cases requiring attention, and the chief constable has already accepted my report on this one. I believe it is important, Miss Marple said. Mrs. Hart, would you be so kind as to show us both Swifts, the old one and the new? Mrs. Hart disappeared into the storage cupboard and returned with her original umbrella Swift, a well-used piece of equipment with a patina of age upon it. Set them side by side, if you would, Miss Marple requested. When both Swifts stood upon the work table, the difference became apparent. The old Swift was slightly smaller, its wood darkened with use, its clamp designed to fit snugly well back from any table edge. The new one, by contrast, was larger, its arms longer, and its clamp constructed in such a way that it could be positioned closer to the edge while still maintaining stability. Now, said Miss Marple, please show us where you would normally position your Swift. Mrs. Hart. Mrs. Hart picked up her old device and clamped it to the table at a spot a good 3 inches from the edge. Here, always. It gives the arms room to revolve without risk of catching on anything, and it's well balanced. And the new Swift was positioned where? Mrs. Hart indicated the fresh clamp marks on the table edge. There, much closer to the edge than I would choose. Slack frowned. So someone moved it forward, perhaps to make more room for the ball winder. Perhaps, Miss Marple agreed, or perhaps to create a specific mechanical advantage. Dr. Haydock, you understand leverage better than I. If a line were fixed, here at the winder's guide arm and ran to this point at the Swift's clamp, what would happen when that line was suddenly released under tension? Haydock studied the arrangement. The winder would be pulled sharply in that direction. Yes, the guide arm would pivot, and anything attached to it would swing with considerable force, the Swift's wooden arm, for instance. Exactly. So, though you'd need the Swift's arm held in a cocked position first, ready to be released. Miss Marple nodded. That is where the needle becomes significant. A long steel needle, strong enough to bear considerable pressure, could serve as a temporary peg or catch. One would pull the Swift's arm back to the desired angle, insert the needle to hold it there, then arrange the tape mechanism to provide the releasing force. She turned to Mrs. Hart. When Sylvia Brent helped you position the Swift, did she test it at all? Spin the arms to ensure they moved freely? Yes, several times. She was quite particular about the angle and the height. I remember thinking she was being unusually meticulous. And the ball winder, when was that positioned? At the same time, she said they worked best when aligned properly. I confess I didn't pay close attention. I had customers arriving, and Sylvia assured me she knew what she was doing. Slack had been examining the Swift's arm with growing interest. This scuff here? It's at the precise height where Mrs. Drake was struck. If the arm had been pulled back and released like a catapult, like a trebuchet perhaps, Miss Marple suggested gently. Medieval in concept, but simple in execution. Tension, leverage, and a sudden release. She moved to the ball winder and pointed to the small thumb screw on the guide arm. This screw shows a fresh score, metal against metal, as though something with considerable force slipped against it. If the tape's hook had been looped around this arm, providing the pulling force, it might have left such a mark before settling into position. Dr. Haydock was running calculations in his head. The force required would be substantial. That tape spring is strong, but would it be enough to cause a fatal blow? The spring provides the initial force, Miss Marple explained. But the real power comes from the Swift's arm itself. It's weighted at the end, designed to hold skeins of wool. When released from a cocked position, it would swing with devastating speed. The tape merely triggers the release. Mrs. Hart had gone very pale. You're describing a death trap built in my workroom, using my equipment. A trap that required both knowledge and opportunity, Miss Marple agreed. Knowledge of how these mechanisms function, and time alone to arrange them properly. Who possessed both? Slack consulted his notebook. According to your statement, Mrs. Hart, Sylvia Brent was here in the afternoon, alone in this room after you returned to the shop front. She said she was winding wool for her demonstration. I had no reason to question it. Miss Marple picked up the ball winder, examining it closely. The guide arm points directly at where the Swift was positioned, not where your old Swift would have been, but where this new one stood. Someone calculated that angle with precision. She set it down carefully. There's another detail that troubles me. Mr. Priest, the wool representative, provided this Swift as a gift. Did he specify where it should be placed? No, he simply said it was modern and efficient. He wanted me to display it to demonstrate the quality of his products, and he was here yesterday evening at the door, mostly smoking. He did come in once or twice to point out features of various wools to potential customers. Did he go into the workroom? Mrs. Hart hesitated. I don't believe so, though I cannot be entirely certain. I was occupied with the till at several points. Slack had been taking notes. Right. So we have Sylvia Brent, who had opportunity and knowledge, who was alone in this room during the afternoon. We have Mr. Priest, who provided the equipment and was present at the time. Anyone else? Mavis Cotter brought the needle, Dolly offered. Though I cannot imagine Mavis rigging anything more complicated than a tea cozy. The needle is central to the scheme, Miss Marple said. But I do not believe Mrs. Cotter was involved. She genuinely believes in the curse, which would be unnecessary if she had planned the mechanism herself. No, the murderer made use of the curse as misdirection, but did not create it. She moved to where the old Swift stood. Mrs. Hart, may I see the cupboard where you keep this? The cupboard proved to be a deep storage space filled with various pieces of equipment. Miss Marple peered inside, then withdrew with a small exclamation. Inspector, you'll want to see this. Inside the cupboard, tucked behind several boxes of buttons, was a woman's coat in bright scarlet boucle, slack. Pulled it out, and they all saw immediately that the left cuff bore a small snag, and a curious indentation as though something had hooked into the fabric and pulled. That's Sylvia's coat, Mrs. Hart said slowly. She left it here yesterday when she was helping with the setup. Said she'd collect it later, but with everything that happened. Miss Marple produced her handkerchief with the red fiber. I believe if you compare this thread with the fabric of that cuff, Inspector, you'll find they match. Slack held the fiber against the coat. The color was identical. She caught her coat on something while arranging the trap, he said grimly. Left evidence behind without realizing it. The measuring tape's hook was twisted, Miss Marple added, as though it had snagged fabric under tension, and the fiber was on the ball winder's knob, exactly where one might lean while positioning the guide arm. Dr. Haydock looked at the coat, the swift, the winder, seeing now how they all connected. She built it in the afternoon, he said. Calculated the angles, positioned everything just so. Then she came back in the evening and waited for her moment. Not quite, Miss Marple corrected gently. She built it in the afternoon, yes, but she did not need to return to trigger it. That was the elegance of the design. Mrs. Drake triggered it herself. Chapter 6 Row Counters and Alibis. Inspector Slack was a methodical man when the occasion demanded it, and the discovery of the scarlet coat had transformed this case from an unfortunate accident into a deliberate crime. He had Mrs. Hart provide a detailed timeline of the previous evening, and he interviewed each person who had been present at the Knit for Winter gathering. Miss Marple, who had been invited to remain during these interviews, sat quietly in the corner with her own knitting, her needles clicking steadily while her ears absorbed every word. Mrs. Ellen Hart had been at the till from 7 until the moment Mrs. Drake's body was discovered. 2 customers could verify this, as could the register tape showing transactions at 27 and 34 minutes past the hour. Mrs. Mavis Cotter had been pouring tea in the main room throughout the critical period. Lady Bantry and 3 other WI members confirmed this in jar, noting that Mavis had been particularly voluble about the needle's history while distributing cups and saucers. Mr. Lionel Priest had been outside smoking, visible through the front window to several witnesses. He had come inside briefly at approximately 7:35 to collect an order book from his case, but had not approached the workroom. Sylvia Brent claimed she'd been demonstrating a cable stitch to Mrs. Pike and Mrs. Henley between 7:30 and 7:40. Both ladies confirmed she'd been with them, her hands working the needles with practiced ease while she explained the technique of crossing stitches, a perfect alibi, Slack muttered to Miss Marple during a brief recess. If she was demonstrating cables, she couldn't have been in the workroom pulling any triggers. Indeed, Miss Marple agreed, though one might wonder what she was demonstrating precisely. Slack looked at her sharply. Meaning? Only that it would be interesting to know if she completed her demonstration, or if perhaps it was interrupted. Nora Pike, when questioned more closely, provided an answer to this. Now that you mention it, Inspector, Sylvia didn't quite finish. She was showing us a 16-row repeat, but she only got through about 12 rows before we heard that dreadful sound from the back room. We all stopped what we were doing, naturally. 12 rows out of 16, Miss Marple murmured. How curious! Mrs. Pike, who was a precise woman who kept meticulous track of her own knitting, added another detail. I noticed Sylvia's row counter when she set her work down. It read 28. I remember thinking it odd, because the pattern she was demonstrating only had a 24-row repeat. Why would she have knitted 4 extra rows if she was preparing a demonstration piece? Slack wrote this down, though his expression suggested he didn't see the significance. Miss Marple, however, set down her own knitting with a thoughtful air. Mrs. Pike, you're quite certain about the number? Absolutely. I always notice such things. The counter clicked to 28 just before she stopped, and the pattern repeat was 24 rows. Yes, Sylvia mentioned it specifically when she began. A classic cable that repeats every 24 rows. Miss Marple picked up her knitting again, but her fingers had slowed. If one were to knit 28 rows of a 24-row repeat, One would be 4 rows into the second repeat, an unnecessary thing to do if preparing a simple demonstration of the pattern. Unless she wasn't preparing a demonstration at all, Dr. Haydock said slowly. Unless she was simply knitting to pass the time while waiting for something else to happen. Slack's eyes narrowed. You're saying the demonstration was a pretense, an alibi she created? I am saying, Miss Marple replied, that if one had arranged a trap to be triggered at a specific time, one would want to be visibly occupied with something innocent when that moment arrived. Cable knitting requires concentration and is sufficiently impressive to draw attention. What better occupation? She paused, her needles resuming their rhythm. But one would need to have been knitting beforehand as well, to have the piece ready to demonstrate. 28 rows suggest she had been working on it for some time, perhaps during the afternoon while she was supposedly winding wool in the workroom. Mrs. Pike nodded eagerly. She did have quite a bit completed when she began showing us. I assumed she'd started it at home. Or, Miss Marple suggested gently, in the workroom earlier that day, while arranging other matters. Slack turned to his notes. Right. So, between 7:30 and 7:45, we have Mrs. Hart at the till, Mrs. Cotter pouring tea, Mr. Priest outside or briefly in the front room, and Miss Brent demonstrating cables to witnesses. Mrs. Drake was alone in the workroom. Alone, and drawn there by a specific purpose, Miss Marple added. She wanted to examine the new Swift, but I suspect she was also drawn by curiosity about that needle. The typed note warning of harm would have intrigued her. Professional judges are not superstitious people as a rule. They pride themselves on rational thinking. So she went to examine it, touched it, and released the mechanism. Haydock said the click, whir, thud that everyone heard. Slack confirmed. Multiple witnesses report hearing it. The timing is consistent. Miss Marple set down her knitting once more. Inspector, might I suggest you examine Sylvia Brent's competition entry more closely? Mrs. Drake made a comment about having seen the pattern before. I wonder if there might be something telling about it. The entry in question was retrieved from where it had been set aside after the judging. It was indeed a beautiful piece of work, a matinee jacket in cream wool with an intricate cable pattern running down the front and sleeves. Accompanying it was a typed pattern sheet bearing Sylvia's name and the title, Twisted Vine Cable, original design by S. Brent. Miss Marple studied the pattern sheet with the careful attention she might give to a particularly complex bit of lacework. After a moment, she held it up to the light from the window. How interesting, she said softly. Inspector, do you see these very faint marks here and here? The paper shows indentations, as though something was written and then erased. Slack peered at it. Could be anything. Rough draft, perhaps. Or, Miss Marple said, it could be the ghost of another pattern, traced and then rubbed out before being rewritten in slightly different terms. The pencil left impressions in the paper fiber. One can just make out lines that don't quite match the typed version. She handed it to Dr. Haydock, who examined it with clinical precision. You're right. There are definitely underlying marks, different spacing on the cable crosses. I think a copied pattern, Slack said grimly. That's what Mrs. Drake spotted. She said she'd seen something like it before. Not something like it, Miss Marple corrected. Something exactly like it, with minor modifications to disguise the theft. Mrs. Drake had a reputation for a sharp memory. If she had seen the original pattern in a magazine or another competition, she would have recognized it immediately. She folded her hands over her knitting. For a designer building a reputation, such an accusation would be devastating, particularly if made publicly at a WI gathering. Professional judges do not make such accusations lightly. If Mrs. Drake had evidence, she would have presented it. Sylvia's career would have ended before it had properly begun. Slack closed his notebook with a decisive snap. Motive established. Opportunity established. Physical evidence established. Time to have another conversation with Miss Brent. I think... But Miss Marple raised one hand gently. Before you do, Inspector, there is one more thing I should like to examine. Mrs. Drake had a clipboard with her when she was judging. Might we see what papers were on it? The clipboard was retrieved from where it had been set aside as part of Mrs. Drake's personal effects. On it were several pattern sheets and entry forms held together with a metal clip. The second sheet bore Sylvia's name, and in the margin, in a firm hand, someone had written, "Lifted from LG 1953. Miss Marple read it aloud, then looked up. Ladies' Guild magazine, I believe. 1953 would be 2 years ago. Mrs. Drake kept excellent records, and in her memory, and she was not one to let such things pass unremarked. Chapter 7. The Pattern Sheet with Pencil Ghosts. The afternoon had turned gray and bitter when Inspector Slack, accompanied by Miss Marple and Dr. Haydock, made his way to Sylvia Brent's cottage on the edge of St. Mary Mead. It was a neat establishment, the sort of place where one might expect to find a designer at work, with good light and careful organization. Sylvia answered the door with an air of wary resignation, as though she had been expecting this. Visit, Inspector Slack, Miss Marple, you'd better come in. Her sitting room was given over almost entirely to her craft. Shelves held wool in carefully organized gradations of color. A large work table dominated the center of the room, scattered with pattern sheets, pencils, and squares of knitted samples pinned to boards. I wonder if I might see your copy of Ladies' Guild from 1953, Miss Marple said pleasantly, as though requesting nothing more controversial than a recipe. Sylvia's face went perfectly still. I don't know what you mean. I think you do, my dear. Mrs. Drake recognized your pattern as having been published in that magazine. She made a note of it on her clipboard. Lifted from LG 1953. A damning phrase for a designer who claims originality. For a long moment, Sylvia said nothing. Then she moved to a bookshelf and pulled down a periodical, its cover worn from use. She opened it to a marked page and handed it to Miss Marple without a word. The pattern displayed there was unmistakably similar to the one Sylvia had entered in the competition. The cable crossings were identical, the decreases placed at precisely the same intervals. I changed some elements, Sylvia said quietly. The neckline, the sleeve length. I thought it would be enough. But the essential design remained, Miss Marple observed. And Mrs. Drake had the kind of memory that recognized such things. She would have made her accusation public, wouldn't she? She told me as much just before the judging began. She pulled me aside and said she knew where I'd got the pattern. Said she would announce it when she gave her verdict, to serve as a warning to others who might be tempted to present another's work as their own. Sylvia sank into a chair, her hands twisting together. You don't understand what that would have meant. I've been building my reputation for 3 years. I have shops interested in my designs, magazines considering my submissions. One public accusation of plagiarism, and all of that would evaporate. Slack had been examining the pattern sheets on the work table. Several bore the telltale signs of erasure, faint pencil marks underlying the final inked versions. How many of your original designs are actually copied, Miss Brent? Not all of them, she said defensively. I do create my own patterns. But sometimes, when inspiration fails, or when I need something quickly for a commission, I've adapted existing designs. Small changes, nothing anyone would notice. Mrs. Drake noticed, Dr. Haydock said quietly. Mrs. Drake had been judging patterns for 20 years. She had an encyclopedic knowledge of knitting publications. Of course, she noticed. Miss Marple had been studying the pencil ghosts on Sylvia's pattern sheet, holding it to the light as she had done with the competition entry. The original, ladies. guild pattern was charted differently, wasn't it? You traced it, then modified the chart to disguise the source, but pencil leaves impressions, and you cannot entirely erase the truth. She set down the paper and looked at Sylvia with something approaching sympathy. You typed the warning note about the cursed needle on Mrs. Hart's typewriter. The letter E strikes high quite distinctly. You wanted to ensure Mrs. Drake would be drawn to touch the needle, to examine it. You knew her character well enough to understand that she would not be deterred by superstitious warnings. Rather, the opposite. Sylvia's shoulders sagged. I never typed any note, but Miss Marple shook her head gently. My dear, denial will not serve you now. The note was typed on Mrs. Hart's machine, which you had access to during the afternoon. You set up the mechanism in the workroom using equipment that you understood thoroughly. You positioned the Swift closer to the table edge than Mrs. Hart's. Habit calculated the angle required for the arm to strike with lethal force and arranged the measuring tape to provide the releasing spring. This is all speculation, Sylvia protested, though her voice lacked conviction. Not entirely. Your scarlet coat was found in the shop cupboard, with a snag on the left cuff and an indentation where something hooked and pulled. A single red fiber from that coat was discovered on the ball winder's knob, exactly where one might lean while positioning the guide arm. The measuring tape's hook is twisted slightly out of alignment, consistent with having caught on fabric under tension. Inspector Slack had been taking careful notes. Now he spoke with official formality. Miss Brent, I must ask you to account for your movements yesterday afternoon between 2 and 6 o'clock. I was at the shop. Mrs. Hart will confirm it. I helped her set up the new Swift, and after Mrs. Hart returned to the front room, a pause, I remained in the workroom for a time. I was winding wool for my demonstration. Or, Miss Marple suggested, you were knitting. Your row counter read 28 when you began your cable demonstration to Mrs. Pike and Mrs. Henley. Yet the pattern repeat was only 24 rows. Those extra 4 rows indicate you had been working on the piece earlier, during the time you were alone in the workroom. You needed to appear occupied during the critical moment, so you prepared your alibi by knitting something that would require your full attention and visible presence. Sylvia's composure was cracking. I don't have to answer these questions. You will need to answer them eventually, Slack said. But there's one thing I'd like to understand first. How did you know Mrs. Drake would go into the workroom at the precise time you needed her to? Mrs. Hart guided her there, Sylvia said, then caught herself. That is, I heard Mrs. Hart offer to show her the new Swift. After you had already set the trap, Miss Marple said. You could not have known Mrs. Drake would accept the invitation, yet you prepared the mechanism anyway. That suggests you had planned to lure her there yourself if necessary. The typed note served that purpose. Even if Mrs. Hart had not offered to show her the equipment, Mrs. Drake would have been curious about the cursed needle and the warning. She would have examined it eventually. She paused, allowing her words to settle. You created what appeared to be an impossible situation. A woman dies in a room with a latched window and an open door, struck by a piece of equipment that no human hand was seen to touch. The superstitious would blame the curse. The practical would call it an accident. Only someone looking very carefully at burnishes, warm tins, and twisted hooks would see the truth. Dr. Haydock cleared his throat. The mechanism was ingenious. I'll grant you that, using household items, spring tension, and leverage to create what amounted to a timed release. How did you learn to design such a thing? My father was an engineer, Sylvia said dully. I grew up around mechanical principles. Gears, springs, tension, leverage. It's not so different from designing a pattern, really. Everything must align correctly for the whole to work. And it did work, Slack said grimly. Mrs. Drake died almost instantly from the blow. Dr. Haydock confirmed she would have had no time to cry out or defend. Herself? Sylvia lifted her head, and for the first time, there was a spark of defiance in her expression. She would have destroyed me. One public accusation, and every pattern I've ever submitted would be questioned. Every shop I work with would withdraw their interest. I would have been finished. So instead, Miss Marple said softly, Mrs. Drake is finished. A woman who had done nothing more than perform her duty as a judge, who had the misfortune to possess both expertise and memory. The defiance crumbled. Sylvia bent forward, her face in her hands. I never meant it to come to this. I only wanted to build something of my own, to be recognized for my work. Work that wasn't yours, Slack said flatly. Chapter 8, A Red Fiber on the Winder. Inspector. Slack was a man who liked his evidence tangible, and his cases built on facts that would stand up before a magistrate. The confession, such as it was, provided motive and opportunity, but he needed the physical proof to complete his case. The coat, he said. We need to establish beyond doubt that the fiber Miss Marple found came from your garment, Miss Brent. Sylvia looked up, her face pale but composed. She had moved past denial into a kind of weary acceptance. It's at the shop, in the cupboard, where I left it yesterday. I caught the cuff on something while I was working. I noticed the snag, but didn't think anything of it at the time. You caught it on the ball winder's knob, Miss Marple said, while you were positioning the guide arm to receive the tape's hook. The fabric snagged, and a single fiber remained behind. Such a small thing, really. But then, truth often resides in very small things. They returned to Hart's haberdashery, where Mrs. Hart admitted them with anxious questions in her eyes. The scarlet coat was retrieved from the cupboard, and Slack examined. The left cuff with meticulous attention. There's definitely damage here, a pulled thread and an indentation, as though something hooked into the weave. Miss Marple produced a handkerchief with the preserved fiber. If you compare them under magnification, Inspector, I believe you'll find they match precisely. The color, the texture, the twist of the yarn. Boucle has a distinctive structure. Dr. Haydock, who had accompanied them, held both up to the light. They're identical. I'd stake my professional reputation on it. Sylvia stood quietly by, not contesting the finding. She seemed diminished somehow, as though the weight of what she'd done had compressed her into a smaller version of herself. Walk us through it, Slack said. I want to understand exactly how you constructed this mechanism. After a long pause, Sylvia began to speak. Her voice was flat, mechanical, as though she were reciting a knitting pattern rather than describing a murder. I arrived at the shop around 2 o'clock. Mrs. Hart wanted help positioning the new Swift. I suggested placing it near the table edge, explaining that it gave better leverage for the arms. She accepted my reasoning and the ball winder. I said they should be aligned for efficiency. Mrs. Hart was busy with customers, so she trusted me to arrange things properly. Once she returned to the front, I had time to work out the mechanics. She moved to the workroom table, her hands hovering over the equipment as though seeing it all. Play out again. The Swift's arm could be pulled back against its natural stop, held in tension like a cocked spring. But I needed something strong enough to serve as the catch, something that would release when touched. The Victorian needle was perfect, steel, rigid, the right length. How did you secure it? I wedged it between the table edge and the arm itself, creating a temporary brace. The arm wanted to swing forward, but the needle prevented it. The pressure would have been considerable, but steel can bear such loads. Miss Marple listened carefully. And the measuring tape. That required more precision. I drew the tape out to its full length, perhaps 5 feet. The spring inside was quite strong after being extended so far. I hooked the end around the ball winder's guide. Arm, then led the tape along the table edge, where it created that faint line you noticed. She demonstrated with her hands, tracing the path without touching the actual equipment. The tape wanted to retract, which meant it was pulling on the guide arm with constant tension. But the arm was secured by its thumb screw, so it couldn't move. The tension just built up in the tape spring, waiting to be released. Released by removing the needle, Slack said. Yes. Once the needle was pulled free, the Swift's arm would swing forward. At the same moment, the tape spring would snap back, jerking the guide arm. The two movements would combine, and the weighted end of the Swift arm would travel in a fast, flat arc. She fell silent, staring at the equipment. At temple height, Dr. Haydock finished quietly. Precisely calculated to strike someone standing at the table. I tested it, Sylvia admitted. Not with full force, but I checked the angle, the height, the path of travel. I used a cloth bundle to approximate the weight and position of a person's head. The calculations were sound. Inspector Slack's expression had hardened. This wasn't a crime of passion, Miss Brent. This was cold, calculated murder. You spent hours working out the mechanics, testing the angles, ensuring it would work. I didn't have hours, Sylvia said. I had perhaps 90 minutes before people started arriving for the evening. But yes, I was thorough. If I was going to do this terrible thing, I needed it to work. Miss Marple had been examining the ball winder again. You must have caught your coat on the knob while leaning in to adjust the guide arm. The hook was already in place under tension, and when you pulled away, a thread snagged and broke. I felt it catch. I should have realized then that I'd left evidence behind. But I was rushed, anxious. I wanted everything perfect before Mrs. Hart returned. And the type note? Slack asked. Sylvia nodded toward the old Remington on Mrs. Hart's desk. I used that. The high E made it distinctive, but I didn't think anyone would examine it closely. I wanted Mrs. Drake to be curious about the needle, to feel compelled to touch it. A warning about a curse would intrigue someone like her, someone rational who didn't believe in such nonsense. You counted on her skepticism, Miss Marple observed. Yes, I knew she would scoff at the superstition and examine the needle to prove there was nothing to fear. That's what rational people do when confronted with irrational claims. They investigate. And in investigating, she triggered your trap. Sylvia's composure finally broke. Her hands came up to cover her face, and when she spoke again, her voice was thick with unshed tears. I heard the sounds, the click, whir, thud. I was demonstrating cables to Mrs. Pike and Mrs. Henley, and I heard it. I knew what it meant, but I kept knitting, kept talking, kept my hands steady. Everyone else thought it was just shop noise, something mechanical. No one suspected, except that you'd been knitting for longer than your demonstration required, Miss Marple said gently. 28 rows instead of 24. You'd been working on that piece during the afternoon while you set up the trap. You needed something to occupy your hands and mind during the waiting, and knitting served that purpose. I've always knitted when I'm nervous, Sylvia whispered. It calms me, the rhythm, the repetition. I didn't even realize I'd gone past the pattern repeat until Mrs. Pike mentioned it later. She lowered her hands, her eyes red but tearless. That fiber, that tiny red thread, such a small thing to betray me. Truth, Miss Marple said, often announces itself in whispers rather than shouts. A warm tin case, a burnished needle, a twisted hook, and yes, a single fiber. Together they tell a story that cannot be denied. Inspector Slack closed his notebook with finality. Sylvia Brent, I am arresting you for the murder of Mrs. Rowena Drake. You're not obliged to say anything, but anything you do say may be given in evidence. Sylvia nodded, accepting. The formal words with resignation. As Slack prepared to escort her from the shop, she turned back to Miss Marple. How did you know? When did you realize it wasn't an accident? Miss Marple considered the question seriously. I think I knew when I felt the warmth of that tape measure. Springs don't become warm through chance. They become warm through use, through tension released. Everything else simply confirmed what that small detail suggested. A small detail, Sylvia echoed. My entire life destroyed by a small detail. No, Miss Marple corrected gently. Your life was destroyed the moment you chose to value your reputation more than another person's existence. The details merely revealed what had already occurred. Chapter 9. A click. Whir. Thud. Heard by all. The following afternoon, Inspector Slack requested that Miss Marple return to Hart's haberdashery one final time. He had arranged for several witnesses to be present, including Lady Bantry, Mrs. Hart, Mrs. Pike, and Dr. Haydock. Even Mavis Cotter had been persuaded to attend, though she clutched her handbag as though it might offer protection against further horrors. I want to demonstrate the mechanism for the record, Slack explained. Miss Marple has agreed to show us exactly how it functioned. The magistrate will want to understand the method clearly, and I confess I'm not entirely certain I could explain it myself. The workroom had been restored to something approaching its normal state, though the Swift and Winder remained positioned as they had been on the fatal evening. Miss Marple stood beside the table, her expression serene but serious. Before we begin, she said, I should like everyone to understand that what we're about to witness is not sorcery or supernatural intervention. It is merely a clever application of mechanical principles that any sewing basket contains: spring tension, leverage, and timing. She picked up the measuring tape from the table. It looked entirely innocent, a simple dressmaker's tool with a cloth ribbon marked in inches. This tape, when fully extended, places its internal spring under considerable strain. The spring wishes to return to its natural state, which means drawing the tape back into its case with force. Watch. She pulled the tape out slowly until nearly 5 feet of ribbon lay extended. Then, holding it at arm's length, she released the button. The tape snapped back with a sharp, decisive sound that made Mrs. Cotter jump. That force, Miss Marple continued, is what Sylvia Brent harnessed. But force alone is not enough. One needs direction and amplification. That is where the other elements become necessary. She moved to the ball winder, pointing to the small guide arm with its thumb screw. If one hooks the tape around this arm while the tape is under tension, the spring's force attempts to pull the arm in the direction of retraction. However, the thumb screw holds the arm secure. The tension builds but has nowhere to go, Dr. Haydock nodded. Like winding a clock spring, the energy is stored, waiting. Precisely. Now observe the Swift. Miss Marple grasped one of the Swift's wooden arms and pulled it backward against its natural position. The arm resisted, wanting to swing forward. The Swift is designed to rotate freely, but one can hold an arm at any position if one provides a brace. Sylvia used the Victorian needle for this purpose. Watch. She wedged a similar needle between the table edge and the arm, creating a temporary catch. The arm remained cocked, held in place by the rigid steel. Now comes the essential element. If I were to draw the tape out fully, hook it around the guide arm here, and arrange it so that removing the needle would release both mechanisms simultaneously. She paused, letting her words sink in. The Swift arm would swing forward with all the force of its weighted end, while the tape would snap back, jerking the guide arm and the winder with it. The two movements would combine into a single devastating blow. Inspector Slack had been watching with grim attention. But how did she ensure the needle would be pulled at the right moment? The typed note, Miss Marple said simply. Warnings attract attention, particularly from those who do not believe in such things. Mrs. Drake was exactly the sort of person who would investigate a supposed curse. Her nature demanded it. She would touch the needle, examine it, perhaps pull it free to see if there was anything unusual about it, and in doing so, she would release the catch. Dr. Haydock finished. The click, whir, thud that everyone heard. First, the needle coming free with a metallic click as it scraped past the silver case. Then, the tape retracting with that distinctive whir of a spring under tension. Finally, the thud, as the swift arm completed its arc and struck its target. Miss Marple looked around at the assembled witnesses. I propose we demonstrate the sound, without the lethal consequence. I will pull the tape to partial extension, hook it loosely over the guide arm without securing the swift, and let it retract. Listen carefully. She drew out the tape perhaps 3 feet, hooked it gently around the guide arm, and released it. The sound was immediate and unmistakable. Click, whir. The tape snapped back into its case, and the guide arm jerked sharply. Mrs. Pike gasped. That's exactly what we heard. I remember it distinctly now. Click, whir, thud, just as you described. 3 separate sounds, but happening in such quick succession that they seemed almost simultaneous to anyone in the main room, occupied with tea and conversation. It would have registered as merely shop noise, nothing alarming, nothing to investigate immediately. Mavis Cotter had gone quite pale. And all of this arranged around my poor needle, making everyone think the curse was real. The curse was convenient misdirection, Miss Marple said kindly. Sylvia encouraged the superstitious interpretation because it deflected attention from the mechanical reality. People who believe in curses do not look for measuring tapes and carefully calculated angles. Lady Bantry had been silent throughout, but now she spoke. Jane, when did you first suspect it was murder rather than accident? The warmth of the tape case troubled me immediately. There was no reason for it to be warm, unless the spring had recently been under tension. Then I noticed the burnish on the needle shaft, which suggested it had been used as a peg rather than for knitting. The pieces began to arrange themselves into a pattern. Like knitting, Mrs. Hart said quietly, following the pattern row by row until the design emerges. An apt comparison, Miss Marple agreed. Each clue was a stitch, and together, they formed the complete picture. The shifted clamp position, the fresh bite marks, the straight rub along the table, edge, the twisted hook, the red fiber, the row counter, reading, the pencil ghosts on the pattern sheet, Mrs. Drake's notation. None was conclusive alone, but together they told an inescapable truth. Inspector Slack consulted his notes. The prosecution will argue premeditation based on the time required to design and test the mechanism. Miss Brent's engineering knowledge will be presented as evidence of her capability. The physical evidence ties her to the scene during the setup period. And the motive is clear. Professional survival, Dr. Haydock added. Mrs. Drake threatened to expose Sylvia as a plagiarist, which would have destroyed her livelihood. Miss Marple began gathering her things. It is always tragic when fear drives someone to murder. Sylvia Brent might have survived the accusation, rebuilt her reputation through honest work, but she chose instead to eliminate the threat permanently. She failed to understand that truth, like a pattern worked in wool, cannot be hidden forever. Eventually, someone will notice the mistakes. Mrs. Pike was examining the measuring tape with wary fascination. To think something so ordinary could be made into a weapon. Everything can be made into a weapon, Miss Marple replied, if one has sufficient ingenuity and insufficient conscience. Sewing baskets contain scissors, needles, pins, tapes with spring mechanisms. Kitchens hold knives and poisons. The objects themselves are innocent. It is the human heart that transforms them into instruments of death. She turned to Mrs. Hart, who had been standing silently by. You must not blame yourself, my dear. You could not have known what Sylvia intended. She was skilled at deception, and she used that skill to tragic effect. Mrs. Hart managed a wan smile. Thank you, Miss Marple. Though I think it will be some time before I can look at that Swift without remembering. Time softens many things, Miss Marple said gently, though it does not erase them entirely. Memory serves its purpose in preventing future tragedies. As they prepared to leave, Inspector Slack approached Miss Marple with something approaching respect. I should have listened to you sooner, about the warm tape case and the burnished needle. I was too quick to accept the obvious explanation. We all prefer the simple answer, Miss Marple said. It requires less effort and causes less disturbance. But truth does not arrange itself for our convenience. Sometimes we must look beneath the surface, notice the small inconsistencies, and follow them to their logical conclusion. Even when that conclusion is murder, Slack said. Especially then, Miss Marple agreed. For murder, once committed, demands justice, not for revenge, but for the simple restoration of moral order. Mrs. Drake, whatever her faults, did not deserve to die for, performing her duty honestly. She paused at the door, looking back at the workroom one final time. Spring. Mechanisms are fascinating things, are they not? So much power compressed into so small a space, waiting to be released. Rather like human emotion when one thinks about it. Both require careful handling. Chapter 10. Workroom. Needle, tape, and a Swift. That struck. 3 days after Sylvia Brent's arrest, Miss Marple sat in her parlor with Lady Bantry. The winter afternoon light cast long shadows across the carpet. They had both been occupied with their knitting, though the needles moved more slowly than usual, as though weighed down by recent events. I still cannot quite believe it, Dolly said, setting down her work with a sigh. Sylvia always seemed so pleasant, so talented to think she was capable of such calculation. Capability and inclination are two different things, Miss Marple observed. Most people are capable of violence under certain circumstances. What separates us is the strength of our moral restraint. Sylvia's restraint failed when faced with professional ruin. She might have survived the scandal. People forget these things eventually, perhaps, but she could not see past the immediate crisis. That is often the way with those who commit murder. They become fixated on removing the obstacle before them, and fail to consider that the consequences of murder are far more enduring than any scandal. Dolly picked up her knitting again, then set it down once more. That poor needle. Mavis swears she'll never touch it again. She wanted to throw it in the river, but Inspector Slack says it's evidence for now. The needle itself is blameless, Miss Marple said, as are the tape measure, the Swift, and the winder. They are merely tools. It was human intention that transformed them into a lethal device. There was a knock at the door, and Miss Marple's maid showed in Dr. Haydock, who had stopped by on his afternoon rounds. Thought I'd see how you are managing. Jane, this business has been a strain on everyone. I am quite well. Thank you, though I confess I have been thinking about the case rather more than is probably healthy. Haydock settled into a chair with the ease of an old friend. Slack tells me the magistrate has ordered Sylvia held for trial. The evidence is overwhelming. Her confession, combined with the physical proof, leaves no room for doubt. Will she plead guilty? Do you think her solicitor is advising it? There's talk of diminished capacity, emotional distress, that sort of thing. But the premeditation is clear. She designed that mechanism with engineering precision. No judge will accept that it was done in a moment of passion. Miss Marple's needles resumed their steady rhythm. She told Inspector Slack that it was meant to be a fright, not a killing. Do you believe that? Haydock snorted. A weighted wooden arm swinging at temple height? She knew exactly what she was doing. The human skull is not designed to withstand such impacts. Any blow with that force would be potentially fatal. Yet people often deceive themselves about their own intentions, Miss Marple said thoughtfully. Perhaps she convinced herself it would only frighten Mrs. Drake, make her ill or unconscious. It is easier to contemplate harm than to contemplate murder. The result is the same, regardless of her self-deception. Yes, the result is the same. Dolly had been listening quietly. What will happen to her designs, the ones that were genuinely original, I mean? Mrs. Hart says some of them were quite clever. I imagine they will be quietly withdrawn, Miss Marple replied. No magazine will want to publish work by someone convicted of murder, regardless of the pattern's originality. That reputation she tried so desperately to preserve is now destroyed beyond any possibility of repair. Ironic, isn't it? Haydock observed. She committed murder to save her career, and the murder itself ensures that career is finished. Sin, Miss Marple said simply, often contains the seeds of its own punishment, not through divine intervention, but through the natural consequences of unethical action. Sylvia's lies about her designs created a vulnerability that Mrs. Drake's expertise exposed. Rather than accept responsibility, she chose violence. That choice has now exposed her to far worse consequences than simple professional disgrace. There was a thoughtful silence, broken only by the click of Miss Marple's needles. I've been wondering, Dolly said eventually, about Mr. Priest. He provided that Swift, insisted Mrs. Hart display it. Do you think he knew anything about Sylvia's plans? I very much doubt it, Miss Marple replied. Mr. Priest is a nuisance and an aggressive salesman, but there is no evidence he was involved in murder. He wanted to sell his synthetic wools and saw the Swift as a promotional tool. Sylvia simply recognized an opportunity when the equipment was delivered. Quite a coincidence, though. Not really. Swifts are common in haberdashery shops. If this one had not been available, Sylvia might have used Mrs. Hart's old one, or fashioned a different sort of mechanism entirely. Murderers adapt to their circumstances. They use whatever tools are at hand. Dr. Haydock stood, preparing to continue his rounds. Well, at least St. Mary Mead can rest easy knowing the matter is resolved, though I suspect the WI will be rather subdued at their next gathering. They will recover, Miss Marple assured him. Communities are resilient. This tragedy will become part of the village history, spoken of in hushed tones for a generation or two, then gradually fading into the general tapestry of events that have occurred here over the centuries. After Haydock had departed, Dolly remained for another half hour, discussing lighter matters. But as she was leaving, she paused at the door. Jane, how do you do it? How do you see these things that everyone else misses? Miss Marple smiled. I simply pay attention, my dear. I observe the small inconsistencies, the details that do not quite fit the expected pattern. And I remember that human nature, beneath all its variations, follows certain predictable paths: fear, pride, greed, desperation. These emotions drive people to terrible acts, and they leave traces behind. One need only look carefully enough to see them. You make it sound simple. Observation is simple. Understanding is more complex, but both are available to anyone willing to exercise them. After Dolly had gone, Miss Marple returned to her chair and her knitting. The gray wool grew steadily beneath her fingers, row after row of simple stitches forming a useful, honest piece of work. She thought about Sylvia Brent, sitting in a cell, contemplating the ruin she had brought upon herself. About Mrs. Rowena Drake, whose sharp eyes and sharper tongue had led to her death, though she had done nothing more than fulfill her obligations as a judge. About Mavis Cotter and her cursed needle, which had never held any supernatural power, but had been made into a symbol of something dark. And she thought about the measuring tape. The Swift, the ball winder, simple tools, innocent in themselves, transformed by human malice into instruments of death. "It is the little things," she murmured aloud to her empty parlor. "The bright burnishes, the warm tins, the single red fibers. They tell the truth when voices lie." Her needles continued their steady work, creating order from chaos, pattern from loose strands. It was, she reflected, not so different from detection. One took the scattered threads of evidence and wove them into a coherent whole. Sometimes the pattern was beautiful. Sometimes, as in this case, it was tragic. But always, always the pattern was there for those willing to see it. Outside, evening was falling over St. Mary Mead. Lights appeared in windows. Smoke rose from chimneys. Life continued its ordinary rhythms, and the village settled into another quiet night. Miss Marple finished her row, counted her stitches to ensure none had been dropped, and began the next. The work was methodical, repetitive, calming, exactly what she needed after 3 days of murder, confession, and the inevitable sadness that accompanied them. Tomorrow there would be church, a visit to the library, perhaps tea with the vicar's wife, the routines that held village life together, that gave it structure and meaning. But tonight there was only the quiet parlor, the steady needles, and the memory of a case solved through attention to the smallest details, curses indeed.